Women are 70% of the perpetrators of domestic violence where the other partner doesn't fight back. When the average person thinks of domestic violence, they think of a poor woman stuck in a violent relationship with a male abuser, completely helpless to fight back. She doesn't even bother as she takes her lumps and then claims her injuries were the result of accident. But is this really the best representation of domestic violence? The answer is no. In non-reciprocal violent relationships, women were the perpetrators in more than 70% of the cases. When women know they can get away with violently assaulting their partner, they do it, and they do it way more often than men do it to their partners. This study completely shatters the narrative that feminists have worked so hard to establish, that men are violent brutes and women are peaceful. This lie, backed by FBI crime statistics that do indeed show that men commit 87% of all the murders. But what if men are just more willing to murder other people because they are more willing to risk their own safety? Well, this study suggests that theory may be true. How else could you explain women's willingness to abuse their own partners when they know the man won't fight back? You just can't. Women don't kill as much as men do because they aren't willing to risk their own safety. Instead, if they want to kill someone, they will get a man to do it for them. More evidence that women are just as violent as men but don't act on it because they are cowards. This also challenges a lot of appeal to nature type of arguments people use to justify misandry, like claiming testosterone makes you automatically more violent and competitive, and that by contrast, women are more kind, caring, and natural nest makers. In reality, there is no established cause-effect relationship between testosterone, aggression, and competitiveness. Alternative explanations for men being more aggressive and competitive could simply be that men's lives are on average worse than women's and the stakes are higher. Plus, there is a looks-based gender bias where both genders worship women and anything else that looks cute. Children, cute animals, cute cartoons, etc., while having subconscious dislike for anything that is not cute. Men, spiders. To examine the prevalence of non-reciprocal and reciprocal IPV, we first classified each relationship as having either no IPV, neither the respondent nor the partner perpetrated violence against the other, or any IPV, either the respondent or the partner perpetrated violence against the other. We classified relationships with IPV as having either reciprocal IPV, both respondent and partner perpetrated violence against the other, or non-reciprocal IPV, either the respondent or the partner perpetrated against the other, but not both. Finally, we divided the relationships with non-reciprocal IPV into those that were perpetrated by men versus those perpetrated by women. To examine the seriousness of IPV by reciprocity, non-reciprocal versus reciprocal, we restricted the analyses to only those relationships with IPV and used logistic regression to model reports of violence frequency and injury occurrence. For violence frequency, because responses were non-normally distributed and the response options were not evenly spaced, we collapsed response codes 1 to 6 into 3 ordinal categories of violence frequency: low WLR responses 1 or 2, medium CHIO response 3, high CHI responses 4, 6, and conducted ordinal logistic regression. For injury occurrence, we coded whether violence perpetration had resulted in an injury or not. Yes, codes 1 to 7, no, Shaka's code 0, and conducted binary logistic regression. Each logistic regression model included reciprocity, non-reciprocal versus reciprocal, and perpetrator gender, men versus women, as predictors, along with several control variables: respondent gender, men versus women, respondent race, ethnicity, white, black, Hispanic, other, education, less than high school graduate, some college graduate, relationship length, less than 3 months versus greater than 3 months, and relationship type, ever married, ever lived together, but not married, never lived together, nor married. Finally, to properly analyze the data, we configured data so that each potential perpetrator in a relationship, i.e. the respondent and the partner, was considered a separate case. This was necessary because comparing comparisons of reciprocal IPV with respect to violence frequency and injury occurrence would be within subject comparisons, i.e., they would be on the same line of data, whereas comparisons of non-reciprocal IPV would be between subject comparisons. Additionally, all analyses were weighted to provide national estimates. 9 weights were assigned to each participant on the basis of grade of education, gender, and race, and according to the sampling frame, which oversampled specific groups of adolescents. Analyses were conducted with SAS to accommodate the complex sampling design and to provide accurate standard errors for analyses. Results Table 2 shows the proportion of all relationships with any IPV, the proportion of violent relationships with reciprocal and non-reciprocal IPV, and the proportion of relationships with non-reciprocal IPV with perpetrators who were men versus those who were women. Proportions were reported for the overall sample and by respondent gender. Overall, IPV was reported in 9% of relationships, with women reporting a greater proportion of violent relationships than men, 4% versus 3%. All among violent relationships, nearly half, 7%, were characterized as reciprocally violent. Women reported a significantly greater proportion of violent relationships that were reciprocal versus non-reciprocal than did men. Women, 51. 10%, men, 46. 9%. Among relationships with non-reciprocal violence, women were reported to be the perpetrator in a majority of cases, 77%, as reported by both women, 7%, and men, 74. To look at the data another way, women reported both greater victimization and perpetration of violence than did men. Victimization, 3% versus 16. 4%, respectively perpetration, 24. 8% versus 11. 4%, respectively. In fact, women's greater perpetration of violence was reported by both women. Female perpetrators, 24. 8%, male perpetrators, 19. 2%, and by men, female perpetrators, 16. 4%, male perpetrators, cancrous, 11. Table 4 shows results of the logistic regression models. For violence frequency, the main effects of perpetrator gender and reciprocity were both significant, and there was a significant interaction. For perpetrators who were men, the reciprocity effect was non-significant. Adjusted odds ratio, AOR 1, 19 pel 17, which indicated that the frequency of violence perpetrated by men did not vary by reciprocity. For perpetrators who were women, IPV was more frequent when perpetrated in the context of reciprocal IPV versus non-reciprocal IPV, AOR 2. Read AP. 01. In other words, women perpetrated IPV more frequently in the context of reciprocal violence than in non-reciprocal violence. As can be seen, a greater percentage of women in reciprocally violent relationships perpetrated medium and high levels of violence, 29, 1% and 7% respectively, than did women perpetrators in non-reciprocally violent relationships, 18, and 6%, respectively. Our findings show that reciprocal violence was about as common as non-reciprocal violence in this national sample of young adults, with about half of violent relationships being characterized by reciprocal violence. More importantly, we found that violence was perpetrated more frequently, by women only, and was more likely to result in injury when it was reciprocal as opposed to non-reciprocal. Our findings that half of relationships with violence could be characterized as reciprocally violent are consistent with prior studies. We were surprised to find, however, that among relationships with non-reciprocal violence, women were the perpetrators in a majority of cases, regardless of participant gender. One possible explanation for this, assuming that men and women are equally likely to initiate physical violence, is that men, who are typically larger and stronger, are less likely to retaliate if struck first by their partner. Thus, some men may be following the norm that men shouldn't hit women when struck first by their partner. A different explanation is that men are simply less willing to report hitting their partner than are women.